And printed copies are on their way. And you are live.
All right, welcome. We are in a joint hearing here on January 15th, 2025. This is a joint hearing of House Education, Senate Education, and Senate Finance. This is part of an ongoing series of sessions of testimony to get everybody grounded in some background in our state education system, both from the finance point of view and the policy point of view. Today, that continues with education law and education funding, and we have up to 3 guests from the administration, maybe even more, to give us our presentation. Many of us have worked in this world for a while. Some of us just had a presentation from JFO, so we all kind of come at it from different areas. But we look forward to sort of further grounding. As I tell my committee, I've been hearing presentations on this every year for 8 years. I always pick up something new that I forgot about or didn't know about. So it's very helpful to me. Anyway, going to turn it over now to our guests to introduce themselves, and the floor is yours. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We really appreciate this opportunity to testify and provide some background on education law and education funding. I'm Zoe Saunders, the Secretary of Education, and I'm joined by 2 of my colleagues. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves.
Sure. Emily Simmons, General Counsel at the Agency of Education.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Craig Boley, the Tax Commissioner.
So as we start this presentation, I think it's really important to emphasize that education funding, governance, and program quality are all inextricably linked. And so as a recap, before we get into the details of the funding, I wanted to reflect on what we've shared previously from the Listen and Learn and also from some of the data reports that we have shared. What we've heard clearly from the Listen and Learn is a need to have clearer direction and guardrails around budgeting. School boards are often placed in a really challenging position to have to cut budgets, and sometimes there aren't really clear parameters around how they can make those choices and how to prioritize to ensure that we're delivering educational quality consistently across the state. We also heard very clearly a need to focus on equity. As we've traveled across the state, that has been described in ways that are very concrete, really ensuring that every student in every school has access to an array of programs and electives and experiences to enrich their educational time in our schools. We've also heard a need for additional support around special education students as we think about both cost and delivery, and expanding career and technical education. Additionally, we've heard clearly that our students are facing more mental health needs, and our schools are doing more than providing instruction. They're really meeting the overall needs of students. So I think it's important to put that in context, because when we're making decisions about funding, it's all around thinking through how we can really reinvest limited dollars in ways that are going to best support student outcomes and address the needs that our students are facing in our schools. As we talk about data, we shared a presentation yesterday, and there's a couple of key highlights that I think are important to call out as part of an overall framing. We see that there's tremendous teacher pay disparity across the state, and it's also creating challenges as we are competing with our neighbors in New England. We know that our Ed Fund is designed to really think about equity, and we'll talk a lot about that in our conversation today. And so this is some things that we're going to think about in practice, what's occurring in terms of ensuring that every student has access to the resources that they need to be successful. So we'll continue to go back throughout this presentation and connecting some of these considerations to what we've heard, our priorities, through the Listen and Learn tour, and what we're seeing in the data are challenges in order for us to meet our shared goals as a state. So today's presentation, we will provide the legal context. I think that's really important for your policy consideration, and it's informing a lot of how we fund education in the state of Vermont. And then we'll walk through an explanation of our current education funding system, and we'll spend some time comparing our system to other states and identifying opportunities and strategies to further strengthen our public education system. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emily Smith.
So the information I'm going to present you today is really just at the highest level, and realizing that my audience is the General Assembly, I'm presenting two sections of statute that I think really underpin the way that Vermont currently approaches education quality and education equity, but reminding you that the General Assembly is in control of those statutory provisions. So we'll start first with the state constitution. If you'll give me the next slide, so thank you. So the right to education in Vermont is enshrined in the state's constitution. We call that the education clause. It is not a unique education clause. It's a little older than many of the other states in the United States, but it is not really an outlier in any meaningful way to other state constitutional provisions. Our provision or a similar one has existed since adoption of the very first Vermont Constitution. And I always like to call out that education is the single government service to ever be included so specifically in our Vermont Constitution, which I think really speaks to the importance that the state's founders placed on education. So the Semel case interpreting the education clause, as everybody I'm sure is familiar, is the State v. Brigham case from 1997. Here is where you have Vermont Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution's education clause and stating very clearly for the first time that the state has the constitutional obligation to provide its students a public education. The emphasis I would place there is really on the state. And so I pulled out one of the quotes from the decision where the court gave us the guidance that although the state may delegate to local towns and cities the authority to finance, administer the system within their borders, it can never abdicate that basic responsibility for education. It can't truly pass on that fundamental obligation to the local governments because they themselves are creations of the state. The Brigham Court held that the education funding system challenge that was in place at the time, that was the subject of the lawsuit, had substantial dependence on local property tax and resulted in wide disparities in revenues available to local school districts, and as a result, found that the system as it existed then did deprive students of equal educational opportunity and therefore violated the Constitution education mandate. The court sort of says on the other hand, right, as courts tend to do. So while that system was found to rely too heavily on local revenues and not equalize sufficiently educational opportunity, they went on to say that they don't mean that the Constitution really doesn't mean that we have to have absolute dollar for dollar equality of funding. It's not necessary. It's not a practical requirement to satisfy the constitutional commands. And that a system might very well include differences among school districts that are related to a purpose of the system, the school district size, student need, etc. So in other words, that equal opportunity does not necessarily result in the need to look at precise dollar for dollar equity. And it does not prohibit cities and towns from spending more if they choose. But bottom line, the Constitution does not allow a system where a student's educational opportunity is a function of the wealth of the district or location where they live. So we can't have geographic and wealth-based distinctions in ultimately what students see and have access to. So pause there. I don't know if the chair wants me to take questions now, but that's everything I had to say about the Brigham decision. So I didn't want to blaze past it if there were clarifying.
Anybody need a clarifying question on that?
Great. So next I wanted to bring to your attention one of the statutory provisions that was adopted by the General Assembly following the Brigham decision as part of the new education funding system. And I always think that section 1, of course, it's very important. It's the first section of Title 16. And I think there are some themes in here that are really interesting. So while it says has very aspirational statements about the guarantees of education being necessary to exercising political and civil rights and success of students, there at the end of the quote, it also says, however, one of the strengths of Vermont's education system lies in rich diversity and ability for districts to adapt educational programs to local needs and desires. So there, the policy statement is essentially freedom and unity, that all Vermont children will be afforded equal educational opportunities, although educational programs may vary from district to district. So I like to highlight that there is some tension in those concepts, and we've had it right from the beginning of the current funding system's adoption. And then the only other provision of state law that I think is to this level of importance is the place where our statutes give the education quality standards. So the minimum requirements for what students will be offered, what they will be taught, what they will learn in our schools is in section 165, which directs the State Board of Education to adopt rules on the education quality standards. And then section also lays out the minimum elements that must be included in those rules. More recently, the General Assembly has added the requirement that the Agency of Education adopt district quality standards. And so among those rules, those two sets of rules, we really have the foundation for what districts are required to offer to their students. Of course, that's just before districts can make those local decisions that we saw in section 1 to offer more or to differentiate those options, expanding on the standards.
Just a little bit of context that might add, when a reference to district quality standards and the legislature enacting those, that did come at the request of the Agency of Education. So that was not an imposition, it was more of a partnership.
Absolutely.
Agree with that.
It's a value add.
Those are my slides on the legal context, so that'll be a great time for questions.
Anything on the legal framework we just heard? All right.
So would like to provide some additional context just to understand the current state of our education system. So this is a map of our supervisory unions and school districts. This is representative of the 2022-23 school year. Since that time, we have added an additional supervisory union and district. So the total is 52 supervisory unions and supervisory districts, that underneath which there are 118 school districts that oversee and govern 287 schools that support the public education of over 83,000 students. You can see as you look at this map that the organization of those districts varies greatly. Some have a large geography, others have a small geography. The number of students that are served also varies as well, from about 400 to about 200, the smallest supervisory union serves students that are 200 to over 4,000 students. So just wanted to share an overview of how we're currently structured. This map is also representing average daily membership. So this is inclusive of those students that are attending public school and students that are attending independent schools. So it does represent the entire student body that the school board is responsible for. The next slide is looking at change in enrollment over time. And so we have spoken about the decline in enrollment statewide. Over the past 20 years, we've seen about an increase of 20% decline in K-12 enrollment. As you're looking at this map, it's comparing the past 4 years. And you can see that there's a couple pockets in our state where we're seeing an increased enrollment, specifically looking at Bennington, White River Junction, and St. Johnsbury. There's also been areas of our state that have had a more dramatic decrease in enrollment. And as an example, you'll see that in the darker orange, such as Grand Isle. So just important to note as we're thinking about overall patterns of student enrollment in our schools. I'm going to walk through at a high level, just explaining our education funding system. Commissioner Bolio will get into detail around how it's actually funded, and I'm going to walk through the overall timeline. So as a context for this, we wanted to share just some key takeaways before we get into the details and the nuts and bolts of the system. No surprise here, Vermont's education funding system is very unique and very complex. We have been partnering with education funding experts who have experience with many different state systems, and they will attest to the fact that Vermont is very unique. The reason that it's unique is it's designed to promote taxpayer capacity in response to the Brigham decision. And as you walk through, that decision is not about ensuring similar resources for students with similar needs. It's about ensuring that there is equity in terms of tax capacity. In practice, we're seeing that lower income communities are not taking advantage of that additional resource. And that's resulting in some of our higher needs districts spending less. And that equates to students in those districts not being able to benefit from the same level of resources. So as the governor has signaled in his inaugural address, he's proposing a shift to a new funding formula. And the rationale for that is to really address and build upon what Vermonters value most about our education system and expand on that concept of equitable funding. So as we've operationalized that in terms of tax capacity, we'll be talking to you about that in terms of educational experiences and educational opportunities, regardless of where students live. As part of this process, it's important for us to think about those features of the system that may not serve us well or as they were originally intended. Our education funding system was developed over 30 years ago. The research around education funding and how it relates to equity has evolved in that time. And also our state has different pressures and different cost constraints than we did those many years ago. So it's an opportunity for us to really think about a better way to deliver education with our current students to yield that high opportunity for every child. So it's notable that any change in a funding formula will require policy decisions about how we deliver quality education, how we define quality, and at what scale. And so those are all some assumptions that we'll need to think about as we are entertaining a new funding formula. I will allow Emily Simmons to expand on this point, but I think as part of the conversation over the years, there's been a recognition that there are different constitutional mechanisms to comply with the Brigham decision. And so as we're walking through, we know that complying with the Brigham decision is a necessity. And we're also looking to identify other ways to promote equity in terms of opportunities for students that they will observe and experience in their classrooms. Anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that maybe what was not 100% foreseen when responding to Brigham and adopting our current model, and perhaps just over time, this is what happens, was that our current system does ensure the ability to raise equitable funds, to provide equitable opportunities, but it does not require that action. It leaves at the discretion of local school boards the decision of what to offer, to what extent to use our equitable ed fund to actually raise an amount of revenue that would place students on equal footing truly from an opportunity and educational experience point of view. So you might think of ways that we could tie up what might be a loose end at the other end. What are the accountability or what are the requirements that would make the promise of equitable funding actually delivered to student experience?
Any questions?
I've got a question. I should have asked it before the general counsel, but the EQS, we have a standard, but do we have a process by which to evaluate that standard? And at what level?
Yes, so that same section 165 in the B subsection does lay out a review process that the agency conducts of all districts to evaluate not only delivery of the education quality standards, but equity generally. I would say it requires the agency to take the least intrusive step first, of course, and then has escalating steps that the agency takes if there's continued failure on those fronts. So yes, we do have that accountability system built into 165. I think it's a question of the implementation and the use of the levers that are in the law that we would like to look at.
Who's responsible for it?
Jointly
If
with-
everybody is responsible, probably nobody's looking at it.
There are different responsibilities, roles and responsibilities of superintendents, of school boards, of the State Board of Education and the Agency of Education.
We released a report to explain our education funding system, and we organized that to address commonly asked questions. So what we'll walk through now is how to respond to these questions that many of you also receive, I'm sure, as you're working with your constituents. So the first question we received is, how is the amount of money provided to each district determined? The second question is, where does the money in the education fund come from? The third question has been, I think, a note recently is, how is my education tax bill calculated and why do some people pay more than others? And then also another very topical question is, how is it possible for my tax bill to increase even if my local school districts reduced their budget or barely grew? And so these answers are all based on kind of the complexity of our system that we'll walk through. So the first question is, how is the amount of money provided to each school district determined? The very simple answer is they receive what they request, subject to voter approval. That's very different than how other states fund their education system. Most states would determine upfront, here's the amount of funding that we have available for education based on an understanding of how to deliver quality, and then districts would operate within those budget parameters. Within our system, a school district will create their budget. They will look at the data. They will engage their stakeholders to identify how to build a budget to meet their needs. They will then take that to the voters. When the voters approve that amount, the state guarantees that funding. And so you'll see that different districts will make different decisions around their budgets, and also that would translate into different per pupil spending across districts. This is a very simplified timeline that Commissioner Volio will expand on, and I'll allow you to get into the details here. But the point here that we just wanted to identify is that as school districts are doing their budgeting, they're working on 2 cycles. They're implementing their current budget, and then they're also planning for the next budget. A key point to note is that we require our budgeting cycle to start earlier, and it also ends earlier. So that December 1 tax letter is a really important first input. And that is developed at a time when not all of the data pieces are known. And it does create some challenges if we're thinking about strategic budgeting decisions and the school board's ability to do that before those budgets have to be warned. What is also unique about our system is that all of the voters vote on that school budget at town meeting day. Once those are approved, then the legislature gets that amount and they have to set the yields to be able to fund fully the education system. We'll talk about some of the more nuances of the other funding that Commissioner Bolio will walk through. And as part of the cycle, we're showing that there's different installments of how those funds are paid out over the cycle. Another question is, how is it that if my budget stays the same, that my taxes could increase? And so this is a very simplified example where we're imagining, and there's 3 districts we're looking at here. District 1 is increasing their overall budget by $500,000. District 2 is staying flat from last year. And then District 3 is having a budget increase. So what many might expect is that if you're, budget decrease, budget reduction. Thank you. So what we might expect is that if you're in District 2 and your budget's staying flat, that your tax rate would stay flat. And then if you're in District 3 and you're reducing your budget, that your overall taxes would have a reduction. But what's actually happening is all of the funding is pooled. And so the state will actually need to raise in total an additional $250,000 in this example. And so for a variety of reasons, that could impact an increase in your taxes, even if your school budget is staying flat or even decreasing. And there's a variety of reasons that would contribute to that, which gets into the complexity of our system. So I'd allow Commissioner Rowley, if you want to expand on some of those factors that would contribute to a district that's staying flat or decreasing, having an increased tax.
Yeah, I mean, there's relationships between grand list growth and the local grand list capacity within a district. There's non-property tax revenue, there's new construction. So all of those things factor into the equation that solves for the yield. But in, again, a simplified example, this illustrates sort of how you can have the statewide spending pressure, increasing pressure on individual districts, even if those districts themselves are flat or reducing their budget.
And the system is based on the per pupil amount, so it's based on your need. So if the need of your student population decreases, you're going to have a decrease in the number of students in that denominator, and so that could inflate your overall population as well. Do you want to expand on that?
I'll hop into that.
Okay, we'll get into that. So this is kind of high level, and we did kind of walk around some of these slides. This is part of our lesson in order to give some level setting and understanding of the key components. Equity is a key consideration as we are looking at our budgeting process. And so really in an effort to increase equity, our current system allows for schools that serve more students with higher needs to spend more per pupil without triggering a greater tax burden on that local community. So it goes back to what Emily Simmons was describing. It gives the ability for those districts to raise those additional dollars. In theory, this makes it possible for schools that serve students with greater needs to have larger budget, even when their communities might not otherwise be able to afford that extra spending. We'll move into health, education, tax rate. Mr. Kelly.
Tax nerds rejoice, do part of the meeting.
This is
Let me
your
just stop real quick. Well, the previous slide, what you're really talking about here is largely Whately.
That's correct.
Yeah, so let's talk a little about how education tax rates are set and then how individual property tax bills are calculated, right? So to set the tax rates, right, you've got to total up education fund expenditures, right? So the largest share of that aggregate expenditure are the aggregated ed spending totals from all the district budgets, right? So that's school budgets less their offsetting revenues, categorical aid, federal funding, reserves, other things. Those get all totaled up. Then you add in all of the other appropriations in the education fund that are statewide costs. For those familiar and looking at the ed fund outlook, right? Those are basically all the lines under the appropriations section that are not the ed payments. So things like universal school meals, transportation aid, special ed, those kind of things. You add all of that up, and then the education fund raises the revenue that it needs to meet those obligations, right? Which is a little bit backwards from how you do budgeting in the general fund. So there are non-property tax revenue sources in the education fund, which we'll hop into in the next slide, but the property taxes are the shock absorber, right? So the property tax rates are set to raise whatever the delta is between the non-property tax revenues and the total in appropriations. And those are done by the legislature setting both a statewide non-homestead tax rate, as well as the property and income yields, which are used to calculate rates for those who pay based on property, and then also those who get a credit based on their income. So let's talk a little about what those sources are, right? So this is fiscal year 25. Again, a lot of attention gets paid on the property taxes. That comprises about 2/3 of the funding in the education fund. Actually, only about a quarter of the education fund is homestead property taxes. The largest share is non-homestead property taxes, which was about 39%. For fiscal year 25, and then the next largest share is actually 100% of sales and use taxes going to the education fund. That was a little over $600 million forecasted for fiscal year 25 and is the second largest share. There are also other revenue sources there in the 9% slice that you see there. That is a combination of a number of things. That's a third of purchase and use tax when you buy a car, a quarter of the meals and rooms tax when you go out to eat, get a hotel room, and also some lottery proceeds. There's a Medicaid transfer, there's some energy taxes in there, and then also some bond interest. So a little more than a third of the education fund is actually raised from non-property tax sources. And again, then the property tax rates are set to be those shock absorbers. And then on the next slide, I would just give a sense of scales to the education fund and the general fund, right? So again, we're looking at fiscal year 25 numbers. So the general fund on the right, about 2.3 billion, the education fund on the left, about 2.24. I would also flag though, in the general fund, I think in fiscal year 25 was about a little over $200 million for paying down the unfunded liability in teachers' pension. So if you include that and sort of the education expenditures, it would say that the education expenditures are actually exceeding the general fund expenditures at this point for fiscal year 25. But even in just nominal dollars, pre-count. So we're going to jump into actual calculation of property tax bills, right? So how are the taxes themselves calculated? There's really three different calculations that we're going to look at. The first is for what's called non-homestead. Now, there's two different types of tax classification for property in Vermont, homestead and non. Homestead is owner-occupied property as their primary residence. And those are declared every year by filing what is called the homestead declaration to the tax department. All other property that is not exempt is not homestead. So I've often heard confusion there. It used to be called non-residential, which made people think that it was just commercial or just second homes or just whatever. but it's everything that is not owner occupied as a primary residence and not exempt is non-homestead. So that's long-term rentals, that's commercial property, industrial property, open land, short-term rentals, second homes. All of that falls into the non-homestead category. Then homestead, owner occupied, primary residence, and then there's also income-based credits for those who are income eligible on homesteads. One of the elements of complexity here is that one property could be subject to all three rates, right? So imagine that I live in my house and my income is eligible for an income-based credit, but I have more than 2 acres. The property tax credit only applies to your house site, which is your home, and 2 acres. So if you have more than 2 acres, the remainder of your property will be taxed at the homestead rate. And then imagine that I have an ADU that I'm renting out on the property. That will be taxed at the non-homestead rate. So one property and one property owner could be subject to all 3 different classes in one property tax bill, which adds to that complexity. So I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is the not, oh, no, I'm not going to start there. This is always the way, you've got to remember the CLA. No. Please go to the next slide.
Okay.
That's where I need to be. I just forgot that we've got to talk about that too. So because we have a statewide education fund, but not all towns reappraise at the same time, there needs to be a mechanism to equalize the appraisal assessments between towns to ensure that each town is paying its fair share in education taxes, right? So the mechanism that we have here in Vermont is called the common level of appraisal. You'll often hear as an acronym, the CLA, which gets applied to the tax rate. Because real estate market has been so hot in Vermont for the last several years, CLAs all around the state and the statewide CLA have been dropping precipitously. And that's created a lot of frustration, it's created confusion, it's created volatility for a lot of stakeholders. One thing that I have heard that I would say is, I do think it's important to note that the CLA is not the reason that property taxes have been going up, but it's a very confusing element of the system, and there are ways that it can feel like the CLA is the reason that property taxes are going up. I think part of that was why the impetus behind the legislature in Act 183 last year created what was called the statewide adjustment, which means for fiscal year 26 and beyond, town CLAs will be divided by the statewide adjustment, or what's the statewide CLA before applying it to tax rates. Practically speaking, the impact of that should be that the pre-CLA rates or equalized property tax rates should be closer to the actual tax rates that people see on their tax bills. I believe that the statewide adjustment this year is 72 and change, I believe. If I got that wrong, I can correct it before the end of my testimony. So now that we have the CLA under our belts, we can move to calculating actual property tax bills. So we'll start with the simple one in non-homestead, right? So in this example, the non-homestead rate for fiscal year 25 is a statewide rate, 1.391 for every $100 of property value. You simply take that statewide rate, you divide it by your CLA, you've got your town non-homestead property tax rate. Every non-homestead property in your town will pay that rate. So in this example, on a $500,000 property, you're paying just over $7,900, right? That one's pretty straightforward. Everyone with me? Cool. Moving to homestead, right? Starts to get a little more complicated. This is the one that moves with per pupil spending. And as the secretary said, right, per pupil spending is based on weighted pupils, right? That's an acknowledgement in the system that certain students cost more than others to educate, right? And you want to make sure that you are providing equity between districts who may have different populations, different demographics of certain students that may cost more or less to educate. So the per pupil spending that we're talking about here is actually based on the number of weighted pupils in the district, which is another one of the ways that your budget in a district could stay flat or be lowered, but your actual tax rate could go up, right? Because if you're losing weights or losing pupils, your per pupil spending is going to go up, even with a flat budget overall for your district. But in this example, let's say the per pupil spending in that district is $13,890. The property yield, last year was 98.93. So you divide those two figures, that gets your district rate, and then you've got to apply that CLA to your district rate, right? So your district rate is about $1.40. You apply the CLA that we put in the prior example, still at 87.83. You get your actual rate of 1.5985. So in this example, your tax on a $300,000 home is just under $4,800. Now you could have more than one town in the district. You could have more than one district per town. And that starts to get really complicated too, right? Because if you've got more than one town in the same district, you're gonna have a situation where their district rate is going to be the same, but those towns are very likely going to have different CLAs. So you're gonna have different towns paying different rates, even though they had the same per pupil spending. It's more complicated even the other way. If you have multiple districts within the same town, it's a blended rate of all of the district rates based on the proportion of students that go to each of those districts in your town. So even though this one's pretty complicated, this is the simple version, right? We're not adding any of these odd situations where we've got multiples in there. And it's really difficult, not only for the stakeholders who are living and breathing this to navigate it, but voters and ordinary Vermonters who are just trying to follow along, right? So then we add on the income-based credit, right? The property tax credit program. So about 2/3 of homesteads receive a property tax credit toward their education property taxes. It's based on household income. It's calculated by the tax department. People file a property tax credit claim with my department. We calculate what they are eligible for, and then we communicate that to towns. It shows up on property tax bills on the state payment line. A really important part of this program and a challenge with the current program is that they are lagged, which means that they are based on the prior year household income and the prior year property tax amounts. This problem came up last year in the discussion because average bills were going up just under 14% statewide, but the property tax credits that those who are income eligible were going to receive this fiscal year were not going to be reflective of that increase. So the legislature put a one-time 13% increase to the property tax credit in the bill last year, which is a very imperfect mechanism, right? It was trying to respond to that problem, but not every community went up the same rate. So some communities were not made whole, some were more than made whole. All of those folks who are getting a property tax credit, it will now be reflective this coming year of that increase. So there's a double benefit there that others paid for. And it's all just, again, very confusing, right? So it's a challenge, and even as the Joint Fiscal Office does the yield model and does the Ed Fund outlook, they essentially have to ignore that lag when they're costing out the property tax credit and the average bill increase because it's kind of impossible to do it any other way. So it's a lot of complexity there.
Senator Chicken has a question.
They ran out of seats up there, so I'd ask you from here. Is it safe to assume, Commissioner Bolio, that the homestead declarers are all Vermont residents that will be expected to file Vermont income taxes? And would it simplify this process if this wasn't done through the property tax bill, but instead at the time they file their income taxes?
So part of what you just said is true. Yes, they are Vermont residents because a homestead has to be owner occupied. I think one of the challenges that you might have moving it to the income tax system is not everybody who files a homestead declaration has a requirement to file an income tax return, right? So you could imagine somebody who is retired, who has just a modest amount of Social Security, for instance, that is completely exempt, may not have a requirement to actually file an income tax return. And we find that there are a fair number of folks who are actually only filing the homestead declaration and property tax credit with us each year. But I am very open to finding ways to simplify this program and happy to participate in those kind of discussions. Okay, so let's jump into an example that actually calculates this out, right? So in this example, we're going to use the same $300,000 house site value, the same per pupil spending, same district spending. In this case, so 13,890 is the per pupil spending we used in the last example. The income yield for last year, or for this year, I should say, was 10,110. It's multiplied by 2% because the income yield is reflective of the amount of per pupil spending that would result in a 2% town income rate. And what that's really reflecting is the percentage of a household's income that they are expected to pay before a property tax credit kicks in. So in this case, you divide the per pupil spending by the income yield, multiply it by the 2%, that gets you 2.75% for the town income rate. You then multiply the household income, in this example, 75,000, by that 2.75%, and that means that this family would be expected to pay $2,063 in property taxes based on income. From the last slide, we calculated that the taxes based on property for that property were just under $4,800. So the property tax credit or the state payment that will be reflected on their property tax bill is $2,733. But remember, that comes next year. not the year that it's applied for. And again, I've simplified this to a great deal. There are a bunch of complexities with this system. There are caps on the house site value that can be income sensitized. There are statutory limits for cliffs within the system at $47,000 of household income and $90,000 of household income. It creates complexities. It creates misunderstanding. There's a myth that I've heard repeated so many times that's really damaging, that people who are income sensitized have no skin in the game in budget votes, and that is not true. If you are under 47,000 in household income, it is true that the income rates are set in statute. And so one could make an argument that maybe they don't have skin in the game, but for the fact that the property tax credit is lagged. But anybody above 47,000, their property taxes are going to move as the income rate moves in their town, right? So there's a whole bunch of complexity even baked into this that makes it one of the really challenging reasons it's difficult for voters to tie their vote to their bill, and why it's really difficult for schools to actually show voters what will happen to their bill when they vote on a budget. Because even if you have the district rates figured out, which are all based on estimates because of the timeline that we showed where the yields are not finalized until after the votes happen, everybody's experience might be different based on what last year's income and this year's income was and how your property tax credit is going to shake out. So there's a lot of complexity in this system that makes it really difficult for those who are living and breathing this every day to follow it, but just everyday Vermonters as well who are trying to figure out what's going on.
This is a good place.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Everyone's tax rate.
But I think that's the end of my slides, so I'm happy to take any questions on those pieces.
So are they working on a new strategy on, rather than doing this for billing, for taxing our?
By they, you mean us?
We're working.
Yeah. You. We are.
Yeah.
All right.
One thing that I would highlight specifically, I mean, the governor laid out in his inaugural that he's going to put forward a plan for an entire education transformation. This is just the one piece of this on the property tax credit. My department did publish a report last month that speaks about this program and some considerations on it and another way to do this that I think may be part of that overall transformation package. Thank you. Sure. All right.
So as Commissioner Bolio indicated, the system is really complex. And I think we've heard that traveling our Listen and Learn tour. It's really hard for voters to understand how their vote will impact their property taxes. And it's also really hard to make these tough decisions around how to reinvest dollars in ways that are going to best promote educational opportunities for students in each district. Overall, there's a lack of budgeting control for the state. So as we described, property taxes can go up in a district that has made significant cuts or has relatively low spending just because of how the dollars are pooled to fund the entire system. At a local level, it's really hard to make these tough choices when there's limited incentives to do some of the reduction in spending as enrollment declines and tax rates can increase despite budget cuts. And so we've often had this conversation of, school boards are in a position because of a lot of the budget constraints and the larger cost pressures of having to make a choice around cutting, when we really now have the opportunity as a state to think about how do we reimagine our education system in ways that can actually deliver on the goals that we share. So what we did is that we kind of talked a lot about, and Emily Simmons has shared, the thought and the research that went into our education funding system. It was really designed to promote equity and to give each individual community the ability to be able to fund at a higher level, regardless of wealth. But it's important for us to look at how that's playing out in practice. And so our team over the last couple of months we've done some deeper analysis and looking at expenditures. And so as we look at expenditures, we see this as peeling back layers of the onion. And so we'll walk you through different definitions of expenditures and explain the revenue sources behind that. So when we talk about total expenditures, we're looking at all sources of funding. So that would include also the federal funds that our districts receive. When we're talking about operating expenditures, we're looking at both the state funding, federal funding, all sources, but we're excluding those expenses that are related to capital or those things that are not on an annual basis. So we actually understand and can isolate what it costs to actually run the building on a year-to-year basis. And then when we're looking at education fund expenditures, this is really focusing on what the state contributes to fund our schools. And so as we walk through this, it's really interesting to see the dynamics. We wanted to analyze this in relation. We want to analyze really the spending in relation to need. So the intent of our funding system is to really promote equity. And so as we've described, you would expect that some students will be more costly to educate because they will need different resources. And our system is designed to give communities the capacity to deliver on that. So what we would expect to see is that our higher need communities are actually spending more and that they're taking advantage of it from the Ed Fund. What we're seeing here in this slide, we're looking at a comparison by size and also by need. The top charts are looking at operating expenditures. And so what you can see overall, so the lighter is less than 1,000. So that is our smallest group. We are seeing that it's a lot more costly as we're talking about expenditures for smaller supervisory unions. And also you're looking at the education fund and you can see that. I think what we were really zeroing in on is how this relates to need. So what you can see in the charts below is that when you're looking at operating expenditures, so that's including state funds, federal funds, we certainly are seeing that there is higher spending in our higher need communities. But when we isolate just the funding that's coming from the state, we're not seeing as meaningful of a difference. And so we would expect to see. So I'm going to pause there just to see if there's any specific questions around this slide.
So do we,
Thanks, sir. So just curious, the acronym FRL.
Free and reduced lunch, so it's an indicator of student poverty.
so just so I'm oriented correctly, we're really looking at the red here to show that, federal dollars are making a difference in some places, but tax capacity isn't necessarily making a difference.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that our lower income communities are relying a lot on the federal dollars to be able to supplement and provide additional resources and support. And so this is important as we're thinking about the fragility of our system and a lot of unknowns as we think about federal funding around how do we as a state ensure that those students that have higher needs are benefiting from those resources. Because when we're just isolating from the state funding source, we're not seeing that that relationship, that higher need communities are being funded at higher levels. I do want to note that this is prior to Act 127 with the new weight. And so it is important to look at some of the analysis that JFO did around fiscal year 25. So in fiscal year 25, the new weights have been adopted. And so we would, but that trend is still holding. And so what you're seeing here is that there's an inverse relationship between spending and need. And that's the opposite of what we would expect to happen if we're talking about an equitable funding system. Pause there. So that's the end of the section around walking through the expenditure. Any questions around this?
I do have one. This actually goes back to Commissioner Bolio's presentation. So one thing that I've always sort of felt was true, but not necessarily know that was true, is that sort of pre-COVID, let's just say, if your district increased spending significantly, there was a stronger relationship between that action and your tax bill. And it wasn't perfect. It wasn't $1 per dollar. We weren't that close because of our statewide education fund, but it was, I'd say, better felt than it is today. Perhaps as a result of the federal funding, I'm not quite sure, but it seems like that. I don't want to call it a truism because it only felt true to me, kind of has blown up in an era of higher education spending, higher need, a lot of federal dollars. Am I feeling that wrong?
Well, always risky to just opine, but I think maybe from my standpoint, I mean, I think what you may be sensing, and I think could help explain that is that the CLAs have become much more volatile since COVID. And so I think that speaks to some of that. That's how it feels like they are driving things to be differently, even though the CLA is not the driver behind taxes going up. Again, everybody's CLA is dropping fairly similarly, which means it's not changing the composition, but it does mean, districts are budgeting to an equalized tax rate, pre-CLA tax rate, and then they're getting their CLA later, and it's much more volatile than it used to be, and that feels worse than it did pre-COVID. I think maybe it's the phenomenon that you're referencing.
That's a good explanation.
Sure.
Isn't it that the excess spending threshold was suspended as part of COVID? One of the COVID sort of
That's true
emergency
as well.
measures was the suspension of the excess spending threshold. So absolutely what you're saying, and there's a policy reason and rationale for that.
Thanks. That's a very perfect.
Commissioner, thank you. The CLA is, you're right, it's not driving taxes going up, but it is driving the rate change going up. So the rates are higher after you adjust for the CLA. So it feels like the taxes are higher, even if it's the same amount being raised, it's a higher rate.
I'm not certain so the way I like to think about it is let's just say that you had just one district and one CLA for the whole state, right? And then you held everything else constant in the education fund. So per pupil spending stays the same, all the other appropriations stay the same. In that case, if just your CLA is changing, right, your equalized rate is going to go down, and then the denominator is going to go down as well, and then push your actual rate back to exactly where it was. But again, because it's not isolated in the system, because all of those other pieces are happening with it, I think that's where it's giving that illusion that it's doing that. But like, for instance, if education spending didn't have the same pressures that it's had over the last few years, like the CLA wouldn't be pushing the actual rates higher on its own.
But the CLA is taking math in public.
I did too. It was real risky what I did a second ago. Hope I got it right.
Maybe I'll talk to you afterwards about it and then.
Sure. Yeah, but that, I like to do a thought experiment where I isolate everything else. Your actual rate is gonna end up the same if all that's changing is your CLA, but it's not the only thing changing in the real world. All of these other things are changing with it. And so I think because it's one of the last pieces that comes into the puzzle, and it's also one of the things that feels most distinct, even though it's in an intertwined system, I think it has the illusion of making it look like it's doing that on its own, but I don't think it is.
The CLA, and this is where I'm gonna risk saying this in public, is the denominator. So when you're
That's right.
dividing by a lower number, you're gonna get a higher result.
That's true.
And so that drives up the rate.
But your equalized rate before you divide by that is getting adjusted by all the other factors in the education.
Yeah,
So
but the
those aren't
actual
moving.
rate that taxpayers are seeing is a higher rate, because even if the actual rate before the CLA adjustment is getting adjusted for everything, the town itself is gonna see that the CLA is gonna be the denominator, you're gonna divide by it, and it's gonna be a higher rate on the tax bills because the CLAs are dropping.
Not if everything else in the education fund stayed the same.
All right, well, we can talk afterwards, maybe
Sure.
Emily or.
I was just gonna say, but the tax bill itself will not change necessarily, but the rate.
Correct,
Which
exactly.
is really what is important to understand, that people see a rate change, but it won't necessarily reflect in their tax bill. The CLA is a self-balancing mechanism to create.
Yeah, and I think even in that case, if everything else was the same, I don't think the actual rate would change. I'm happy to walk through some examples online.
Well, there's certainly supporting evidence that we have a complex system.
There you go. Complexity will be the buzzword, right, of this session. So I think just to wrap up this particular section of our presentation, there's a theory of action of our education funding system, right? And that theory of action is that we are giving communities the ability to be able to meet the diverse needs of students, right? And so they can raise additional dollars without a huge tax burden. And so that we would assume that through that, we would see our higher need communities spending more to meet the more acute needs of their students. But as we peel back the onion and we do the analysis of spending, we're actually seeing an inverse relationship. And I think that plays out in a very clear way last spring in the budget session, where we saw some of our lowest spending highest needs communities struggled the most to pass their budget. And so in order to pass their budget, there were a lot of really difficult conversations around cutting that happens. So I think it's just important to think about, you know, our intent is to be equitable, but in practice, what we're seeing playing out is that our lower income communities are actually spending less. And so we know that that's going to be a challenge as we think about meeting the diverse needs of all of our students across the state. So as we get into the next section, we'll talk more about governance and scale of our system. So Vermont's system is quite complex. We started by showing our supervisory union structure and our district structure. We tend to have, when compared to other states, significantly more school boards overseeing a smaller number of students. The supervisory union in and of itself is quite a unique construct. And so what that can mean is you could have a superintendent that's supporting to multiple boards. And that can be, you know, a real challenge as you think about just timing of being able to appropriately meet with every board and share information. It's also challenging to create consensus when you have that type of a you know, diversity and complexity of your governance structure. On average, supervisory unions have one board member for approximately every 75 students in Vermont. So that's a very small ratio. Another consideration is that our boards tend to be very local, hyper-local, and yet our spending is shared, right? There's one pool of funding. So that creates a real challenge as you're thinking about making decisions that are important for your local community and also for the shared community of all Vermont students. So what are some of the implications of Vermont's governance structure? As a result, there's also the description of, you know, we're instead of administering a system of schools, we're overseeing very individualized schools. So really, it creates some fragmentation and really thinking about the overall system and creating alignment. And that plays out in terms of different curriculum and different requirements, which can be challenging when students are moving from one district to the next or even one school to the next. It can be challenging with our current governance structure to reach agreement on common policies and programs and practices across grade levels, and making sure that there's an efficient, effective use of resources. It can be challenging to respond effectively to the needs and wants of each school board. And we talked about that in terms of the superintendent's time of being able to manage those expectations when you are reporting to a number of boards and a number of school board members. And as we said, if you think about this, it does challenge our ability to think kind of system-wide around where there should be alignment and continuity to promote consistency in terms of educational quality and programming. So with our current governance structure, it can be really challenging to moderate spending, to increase achievement, and to ensure equity for all Vermont students. As we talked through the listen and learn tour, there was a lot of conversation around local control, and we continue to hear the need to balance Vermont's motto of unity and freedom. We certainly, as a state, want to make sure that there's that local ability to customize to meet the needs of every student. But in certain areas, it's going to be important for us to have more unity. And we're hearing that from the field pretty consistently, because in areas that we don't have unity, it creates more burden on the local districts. And also more challenges on the school board to be able to make some of the tough decisions that they're faced with. So local control really requires a very key set of conditions to be really not only effective, but also equitable. It requires communities being very willing to invest heavily in education. It requires consistently high property values, tax capacity. We also know that there are a lot of external cost pressures that are outside of the local board's control. And so it can be really challenging to really make those decisions at the school board level because there's a limited ability to make adjustments to the budget, such as healthcare costs and things of that nature. For local control to be really effective, there needs to be more of a community willingness to share resources, particularly in our smaller supervisory unions or in areas of our state where we're really struggling to hire qualified teachers and specialized staff to support the needs of students. I mean, it also requires an ability for all members of the community to understand how the system works. Because the system is certainly designed to support local decision-making, but because we're pulling from one statewide fund, it does require an understanding of the overall statewide needs in order to make decisions that are going to be equitable for every student. So what we heard from our listen and learn tour was the need to balance the consistency of statewide requirements in key policy areas. And we've often heard this from school board members of, we have a really tough decision to make as it relates to budget, and there's not really clear parameters from the state that are helping us to make these difficult decisions with our community. And how do we prioritize making cuts here or making investments here? That all goes back to having a very clear understanding of the state of what we are defining as educational quality and prioritizing. We did hear a lot in our listen and learn tour that local control sometimes feels like a myth, just because we're doing local budgeting within this statewide context. And for all the reasons that we described, even if a local school board is making some of those decisions based on the best interest of their community and they're holding their budgets flat, they can still have an impact and increased tax rate for a variety of factors that we explained. So sometimes it can feel really stressful, I think, at the local level to be able to make these decisions because so many of the statewide factors are influencing their ability to implement their desired programs and to invest their resources in what they think is most important. So we'll talk also about tuitioning. That's another unique aspect of our overall system. And so I'll allow Emily Simmons to really expand on a lot of the nuance within the rules and laws governing tuitioning. But basically, a student who lives in a town with no public primary or secondary school is provided the opportunity to attend another school through the process of tuitioning. That can occur tuitioning to another public school or tuitioning to an independent school. And we'll walk through some of the details around how that can play out. On the next slide, we'll actually show you a map of tuitioning so you can see the overall patterns of how tuitioning occurs throughout our state. So I'm going to allow you to expand a little bit more on the practice of tuitioning.
Sure. So first is the amount of tuition, right? So in a tuitioning school district for all grades, if it's an all tuition system, or for those grades where the school district does not operate a public school for that grade band and instead pays the tuition, the student is entitled to attend a school of their choice among public schools and including within those schools inside and outside of Vermont. And the amount of that tuition, the value that they have to attend, is based on a default that has three major exceptions. So the default is the average announced tuition. That is a number that is generated by the Agency of Education that is based on Union High School's tuitions that they charge across the state for that school year. The three exceptions to that average announced tuition are: one, for our independent schools that are designated as area career technical centers. The second is for schools that are designated as they've been found to meet education quality standards. And the third is left up to electorates of school districts who have the ability to, at town meeting, approve a higher amount that they will pay above the average announced tuition, which can include the full tuition charged by named schools, approved independent schools or public schools. Public schools receive the full tuition that they charge. The extent of tuitioning really occurs around the state. Every pocket of our state has some school districts that tuition rather than operate. The vast majority of students are in school districts that operate schools. So we have a large number of schools that pay tuition, but most of our students attend a larger district that operates all grades. So generally, we've had this as a historic practice that benefits rural areas where there were not schools historically, and so the practice of tuition popped up to not build a school in that very small rural community. We find that so in many districts that tuition, but particularly in the pattern of school districts that operate an elementary school but pay tuition at the secondary levels, it's very challenging to have no control over the tuition and costs in the upper grades. And you see the common pattern of cuts taking place at the elementary level where we do operate in order to make room for those tuition payments that the students are entitled to and the school district is obligated to pay. So our last bullet is to keep in mind that less than 1% of students who tuition.
We have a question.
Well, she can finish her thought.
Oh, sorry, this is again pointing out that it's about 1% of students, but that 1% excludes students, we talked about this in this committee room yesterday, who regardless of the operating pattern of their school, might attend special education, independent schools.
That would be less than 1% of students who tuition, not less than 1% of all students in Vermont.
Could the average announced tuition is a rate set based on Union High Schools setting their tuition number. So that gives us a number, let's call it $18,000. Does that apply to then students who are in elementary school, going in a choice town, going to a private elementary school? Can that private elementary school charge that full amount?
So the tuitioning to private elementary schools is limited in other ways. So I need to follow up with you on that because the real common use of the number is for the upper grades.
So with upper grades, if a school, an independent school can have a tuition rate that it charges for everybody, but they can have a higher, they can charge up to the average announced tuition for a sending town.
As the default, yes, absent one of the 3 exceptions. You can also have a further complication of a student who resides in a tuition paying town, and none of the 3 exceptions apply to them, and so they're entitled to attend at the average announced tuition, even at a school who charges more. And so you can have a gap that the family would need to take to support that student's attendance.
Okay, Senator Heffernan, then Senator Hardy.
So is there an average tuition that, and is that tuition, is that showing the quality to wherever they go? That, is it based on that? So that money that tuition you're giving includes, as we try to do in the state, equality in education. And if the answer is yes to that, then why doesn't the state, why haven't we as the state said $18,000? That's what the state will give, doesn't matter which school it is. That's what the state will give you because that's what we give tuition for this child to go other than your school district.
I think my answer to your question is that the word average in the label average announced tuition might be a very misleading use of the word average because it is only of certain high schools and it is only of certain of their costs. So while a huge function of that number is the amount of money that those high schools as a group spend to educate their students, it's not a direct relationship between what they're spending to educate students at that system. It's we have several exclusions from that number and an annual true-up process that the schools are required to participate in before the agency announces that amount.
Thank you. Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On your slide, the bullets about the number of school districts, is 95 out of 119 correct? That doesn't sound right because you're saying 95 out of the 119 school districts pay tuition for all high school students? There are more school districts that operate high schools than pay tuition. So how are you measuring that?
So what's interesting on this next slide is we're actually mapping that and understanding the tuitioning pattern. So on this next slide, we will see in blue are those districts that are fully operating a K-12. In green, you are going to see a hybrid. So that's going to be a lot of what you just described, where they might operate through elementary or middle school and then tuition to high school. The yellow on this map is representing all of those districts that tuition only, so they don't operate any school, and it's fully tuitioned if those students live in towns. And then in the kind of reddish color is looking at the overlapping classifications where they would have a district, they would have a tuitioning that also feeds into another school district pattern. So these public.
So what based on that explanation, there are only 24 school districts that operate K through 12 and don't tuition anybody. There should be only 24 blue districts, and I think there are more than that.
We can double check.
I think that 95 refers to the number of towns
Oh,
and not school districts.
okay.
You guys will check that, but I think.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm going back to when we were editing that report. So all this is coming from our education funding report. And so in that section, we were talking about thank you very much, Senator. They were talking about the decision that towns make around tuitioning. And so
Okay.
within the context of that, that's absolutely right that it is.
Okay, you might just want to clarify those
Sure.
bullet points because
It's always
apples
helpful.
and oranges.
Yes, it's always helpful to clarify, and I appreciate the question. So it is, when we start to look at these maps, it is an interesting interplay, as you talked about the towns and also district decisions within the overall way that we decide to educate a student. So I think in just looking at this map, you can see that there's a lot of complexity. You can also see that there's more regional patterns in terms of tuitioning. Any questions before we move into implications for teaching and learning?
Well, actually, no, that's one. Yeah, it's okay. Just to make sure I understand this. What is the difference between hybrid and overlap?
Yes. So if you could give the specific example of like Lake Region, for example, I think is one, Central Vermont is another. So you would have one, like a high school, that is overseeing multiple towns that are feeding into it, that have their own school boards and districts. So you feel like Lake Region.
I think we might need to work on those.
Okay.
on our map,
Okay.
Zoe.
Okay. Okay. So part of when we're starting to do this mapping, and this is another layer that we can do, is we can show tuitioning just for grade levels. And so there's some complexity here too, in terms of how we're defining grade levels. So is an elementary K5, is it a K6, is it a middle school 7, 9? How are we defining the union middle high school? So some of this was an attempt where there were some of those complexities in terms of the grade configuration also to do some of that overlapping. So what we can do is a next series is actually produce maps that are more refined by the grade levels that are tuitioned. And I think that might be helpful for this conversation because it does get complicated when you're having different patterns of where students are eligible to attend.
So,
Yeah.
can I also, hi.
Yeah.
Gilbert
Yeah,
Campbell,
Gilbert Campbell.
Interim Deputy Secretary, we're like all in this room today.
Yeah.
I also, we can definitely do some more refinement of maps. I also would direct folks to the appendix of the ed funding explained report that we put out. It's many pages long, and it's literally district by district, what is their tuitioning for each district? So, and then organized under the FU or FD. And that will help you to interpret this map a little bit, particularly in places like Southwest Vermont, where it's like the red. It's, you have these smaller, say a K through 5, and then over, you may have multiple of those, and then over that is a unified high school district. So it will help, and you'll also see again, complexity is the buzzword of the day. So you actually be able to see how complex it is. We also include, so what grades they tuition, and then the number of board members in each district. And it's in 6-page.
Just want to do a time check. We've got House members have a hard stop at 3. I see that there are a few slides left to go.
Just what is the gray in the center?
That's
Is that
Lincoln.
That's Lincoln?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm like,
And that was the addition, so that's the new district that was added in the past year. So we'll kind of breeze through this because this will be part of much broader conversations, but every time we talk about funding, we want to really center that around impact on teaching and learning and those best practices. So, within the Vermont context, we've shared that we tend to have very small schools. We tend to have very small classes compared to other states. And so there's, research that we've been looking at that small class size do not necessarily equate to better student outcomes. There's also the opportunity when you have larger classrooms and more classrooms within a grade to support teacher planning and sharing best practices and things of that nature. But there is what we call an opportunity cost due to our small class size. There's a challenge to be able to fund specialized teachers that can provide support to all students within the school or within the district. Also, because of that, when we're talking about overall teacher pay, while we're one of the highest spenders in the country on education, we're not seeing that translate necessarily into high teacher pay. And we are seeing some challenges across our state and being competitive in recruiting and retaining teachers. It also does make us rely on a lot of provisional teachers with provisional licenses or emergency licenses, and also on paraprofessionals as well to deliver with our some of our current models for our staffing agencies. So some of the things that we've been providing support on as it relates to budgeting are related to how can we be most strategic with budgeting. We've identified some patterns in the education funding report that there tends to be a phenomenon of rounding up. And so that can be challenging as you're thinking about doing precise staffing to meet the unique needs of your student population in your building. We do see examples and really great examples of schools that are doing shared staffing within their district and across grade levels. And so those are practices that we can look at as we move forward. But we have this past December, we did a training series to really help districts and school boards to maximize their staffing and be more precise and strategic, and also given some resources and best practices to share with their communities as they're engaging in those really challenging conversations. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these really compelling strategies emerge through innovation in small rural communities, and they're practices that can be replicated. So this is a really key point, and we've kind of peppered this in across the presentation today, is how do other states fund education system? We've already called out that Vermont system is very unique. 48 other states do some version of a foundation formula. And so we're really unique and being different than that. Most other states will calculate a base formula, and they will do that based on a variety of ways. We'll go through some of the methodology, but all of that's built into an understanding of what funding you need to provide a reasonable education to your students. They also identify upfront the amount of money that the state will fund. And so the state would say, this is the amount of money we have, districts is what you have to work with. In the state of Vermont, the districts will determine the funding amount and then ask the state to fund that. And that's what we would use to raise that yield. So school systems build budgets within the limits of the money they're going to receive in most systems. So that's a little bit different here. And we talked about the need for additional budget parameters that could also be supportive of school boards and districts making those tough decisions as well. And then in some states, there is the ability to have additional spending above that funding formula. And there are a number of mechanisms that are in place to ensure equalization and that equity in terms of tax capacity. So what are the different types? And we can weigh into this. I think tomorrow we have a presentation on the foundation formula, but there's a variety of ways that states approach this work. Some look at the available revenue and take it as a math problem in terms of deciding what we could fund for students. Others are using a foundation formula that establishes a base weight based on an understanding of what high quality education will be, and then weights which would differentiate based on needs. So assuming that certain students require additional resources to educate, such as those students living in poverty or English learners, there would be a weight to adjust for that. Other systems will be more specific in terms of just determining that funding based on the number of teaching positions and staff available and those operating costs. So that typically doesn't provide for as much flexibility within the district, but certainly is establishing some parameters around quality. There are some states that are looking at a hybrid model where they do a combination of establishing a foundation with base and weights, and then also understanding what does that represent in terms of the position and the staffing you need to be able to deliver on that. And those staffing are typically defined in terms of ratios. And then there are state-specific systems that are very unique, including Vermont. and Michigan. And we can unpack a little bit more of how these states are approaching their work. But I think it's, as we dig into this deeper, it's important to look at, what other states do and what part of those practice could best serve Vermont and where we may need to have some customization. In our education funding report, also in the appendix, we have a breakdown of the different ways that states approach this work. So this is an example of that. And we also, in the appendix, provide more detailed description around what goes into developing a foundation formula, how position allocations are defined, and the different variations for these hybrid systems in other states. So I think that's an important resource as we engage further in thinking about funding. So key takeaways from this presentation, that funding, governance, and educational delivery are all linked. And so as we're approaching conversations around how to fund our system, it's really important that we do that in the context around how we define student success and how we define equity for our students across the state. We've, I think, hit it home that Vermont's education funding system is unique and it's really complex. That is shaped by a very well-intentioned to provide taxpayer equity and to promote that local decision-making. What we're seeing in practice is that there is inequity in terms of districts' ability to provide a well-rounded education and to guarantee that students with the same needs get the same resources. The current funding system is very confusing. It's also very unpredictable to the taxpayer. And because of some of the system challenges, it inhibits strategic budgeting at that district level to promote financial solvency and academic outcomes. So at every presentation this week, we've been leaving you with key considerations that we've been contemplating and that really are informing an overall recommendation around policy. So one of the questions is, how can Vermont reduce the inequities in per pupil spending to ensure that students with similar needs receive similar resources? How can we align funding and resources with student needs to drive student outcomes and success? How can we create more meaningful opportunities for students and support a whole child approach to reduce absenteeism and improve student engagement? How can we support effective and cost-efficient delivery of special education services in all districts and schools? And how do we ensure that every student has a highly qualified teacher in a safe, healthy, and welcoming school environment? So all of these considerations are feeding into the governor's education transformation proposal to think about how we do that through multiple mechanisms. And I think as we've all discussed, this work is the challenges that we face are really complex and will require a multifaceted solution. And so when we talk about funding, it's not just about funding, but also making decisions around how do we deliver education and what scale is important, what guardrails do we need to be in place, and how are we ensuring that there is a consistent level of educational quality across our state to give every child in Vermont exceptional access to education. So I'll leave it there and open for questions.
Senator Dooley.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was enlightening. The word equity was used a lot in the presentation, and I really appreciate that. At the same time, it's a word that can become kind of hollow if we don't attach specific examples to it. So one question I have is around, and it's connected to cost, but let's say class size. In terms of equity, I look at some of our private and independent schools that receive tax dollars. They brag about the fact that their classes are only 15 students to one teacher. And they're very proud of the fact that they have, 7 kids per one staff member. Whereas my sense is, from observations, anecdotal, but that public schools are almost ashamed of calling out low class sizes. They're scared to talk about ratios in that way. So my question is, moving forward in light of equity, how will the governor handle that dichotomy that we see in our system?
Yeah, so a 15-to-1 ratio, we actually have a lot of schools that have well below that.
But my sense is, moving forward, you want that to be higher generally.
So I think what we're seeing is that there's a a variety of factors that will play into that in terms of establishing, what are the right ratios, to deliver education. We know that there's a lot of limitations. We talked about the challenges when you have that small of a class size. It's really hard to hire teachers. So I think there's another consideration where we're talking about, we don't have right now in Vermont, the workforce to fill the positions that are open. And that's why you're seeing a real increase in the number of teachers that are on provisional and emergency licenses. So there's an opportunity for us to really think intentionally around how do we ensure that every child has access to a high quality teacher. I think to your point, there's a broader conversation around accountability, and really ensuring equity in all settings. And I think that does need to be part of the conversation.
Given that the bell is ringing, I think we'll wrap here, but just with the caveat that we have to go to the floor. You all want to use the room and continue to chat informally after we break up, get free.
The finance take a 15-minute break and then